So you were in the National Guard, and then it was reserves, and then you went to active duty. When was this, and what made you want to get into active duty?
In May of 2021, I'd kind of gotten bored with life during COVID, sitting at home, staring at all the Zoom calls. So I decided to go back to active duty, and that's where I found myself at Fort Carson in Colorado Springs, Colorado.
And then what happened after that?
So in September of 2021, I got deployment orders on my birthday to Syria, and I was pretty excited. My wife was a little nervous for me. We had recently gotten married, and we packed it all in. I sent her back home to North Carolina, and I hopped on a series of flights that ended up with me in Kuwait before we took C-130s over to Iraq and finally convoyed into Syria.
Tell me more about that.
Arriving in Syria was one of the more interesting moments in my life. If you've ever seen Kansas, it's a place almost as flat as Kansas, but if you replaced all the corn with sand, that's kind of what you would find. The level of destruction there, I'd seen Iraq, I've seen other places in the Middle East. I worked in Nepal after the earthquakes in Nepal. I've never seen a level of destruction that severe in my entire life, and you could tell it was the remnants of where ISIS and the other various actors in the region kind of fought it out with each other. Every single tiny village you drove through, every single wall was bullet-pocked. There was collapsed buildings everywhere. There was one famous little area we loved to take some photos around, just because it was 10 buildings lined up in a row, and one main tank round had just went directly through every single one of the buildings, and you could stand at one end and see somebody 200 feet away through all of the buildings.
Oh, wow.
Mm-hmm.
So, what was the United States' main mission in Syria?
According to all of our pre-mission briefs and pre-deployment briefs, we were supposed to be going to Syria to do ISIS suppression missions and to make sure that ISIS was not regrouping and reforming in some of the more remote areas in northern Syria and along their border with Iraq. What we found when we got there was entirely different. There were multiple actors. I'll try to break them down for you briefly. The Russian army operated near us. The Syrian army was all over our area of operations. There are Iranian militias. There was the Turkish army proper, Turkish militias, and then a handful of different Kurdish militias that generally aligned on most issues, though they would occasionally fight each other as well. And what we found ourselves doing most of the time was route reconnaissance to deny the Syrian army the ability to set up new checkpoints in the north. And the other side of the mission was keeping an eye on the Iranian militias, but kind of the prevailing background mission set, it felt like, was that we were trying to stop Turkey from fighting the Kurds. Every week or so, thousands and thousands and thousands of rounds of ammunition would flow into the country, munitions would flow into the country. We would offload it, we would give it to the Kurds. The Kurds would drive out the back gate and immediately resume fighting with the Turks. When we would patrol through villages, we would get out, we would do the normal United States thing where we passed out water bottles and asked the locals if there was anything we could do for them. And frequently they would look to us and say, "Can you make Turkey stop?" And you would think, with the United States being one of the most powerful members of NATO, that it would be an easy yes, but for diplomatic and political reasons, the answer was always no, we can't really do anything about it.
So what was this all like from your point of view?
I was a gunner in an infantry platoon in Syria. Normally, even in the National Guard or the Reserve, in my experience, when we were getting ready to go on a training deployment or a rotation to the National Training Center, you wanted as many warm bodies as physically possible. Your unit would plus up to over 10% strength. When we were going to Syria, we were told to do the exact opposite. So we left with less than half of an infantry company and occupied this base that was adequate. It had adequate facilities, but it was pretty exposed, and it was just the 60 or so of us plus the drone attachment that was there. Then there was a handful of French Special Forces and Green Berets there, and that kind of shaped what our mission set was going to look like. So from my eyes, I fell in as a gunner. So on the top of the JLTV and Max Pro trucks we used, we have the M250 cal on top. I was a gunner for every patrol except for 3, I believe. So unlike most of the folks, when you're in the back of a Mat V or Max Pro, you're not seeing almost anything. I got to see and feel the desert up close. It was bitterly cold most of the time. It rained a surprising amount. The first white Christmas I've had since I was a child was actually in Syria. It was just different because every time we came to an intersection or we had to stop for whatever the reason may be, I was directly engaging with the civilians. I was talking to them or motioning to them or like playing back and forth with their children. It put a humanizing aspect on kind of what we were seeing there. And it also kind of stopped me from becoming detached because about 3 months in, everybody was getting bored with our mission set at the time. The danger was prevalent, but it never really presented itself. You've probably heard from folks who've been to Iraq and Afghanistan that sometimes the rules of engagement get a little politicized. I felt like ours was at the extreme end of that, being that small arms fire and below, we could not return fire. Our SOP was actually to button the trucks up and return to base or evac out of the area and then continue mission. So it had to be an RPG or larger to engage us before we could shoot back. I've got a fair bit of GoPro footage where folks would just come out and level small arms at us from 20 to 30 yards away, and there's just absolutely nothing we could do about it. And to really drive home that point, the 82nd Airborne had actually operated in that same area as us about a year before, and when they received contact, they returned fire, they killed a few Syrian army guys, and the United States Army actually court-martialed the platoon sergeant there. And it took him over a year and a half before he was finally acquitted of the crime, just for defending his soldiers. So in my position as a gunner, I felt an extreme bit of anxiety because in one hand, there are people pointing weapons at me from danger close range. And on the other hand, if I shoot them, I might go to prison even though we're at war. So we arrived towards the end of 2021, the last quarter of 2021. At that time, pretty quickly, we actually opened a joint medical clinic with the Russians for a short while. So we were treating Syrian and Kurdish civilians, rendering basic medical aid, giving them shots, etc. And that was a very friendly, close encounter with the Russians. They seemed adult. They were very professional. Syria was a sought-after assignment for them, is what I got from our... We had rough conversations through translators, so every time we would go out on patrol, we would always have a translator that could speak the local language, and 90% of the time we would have a translator that could speak Russian as well. So we were able to communicate roughly with them. On another occasion, to give kind of more depth to the Russian issue, we were out on patrol and we encountered an area where the Syrian army was not supposed to have a checkpoint. So in northern Syria, while it's mostly Kurdish controlled, there are pockets of pro-Syrian government forces. And we're driving along this dirt stretch, there's nothing else out there, and suddenly I'm in the first infantry truck, but right in front of us we have a group of engineers. They don't have anybody up on the gun. Our pre-mission brief is if somebody runs out the road and tries to stop the convoy, drive around them if you can, run over them if you can't. The engineers panicked and smashed the brakes when folks ran out in front of them. Well, there's no cover to our left, there's no cover behind us, and there's just 3 little mud compounds on the right-hand side, and Syrian fighters just come pouring out of these compounds, like 25 to 30 of them. Within 2 or 3 minutes, a truck is driving up and dropping off more of them. And the issue with that is we're out in 3 trucks, we have 14 dudes or so with us, and once you take the gunner and driver out of the equation, you have like 6 or 7 people you can dismount with. And we are now fully surrounded on all sides. Like these folks are 25 to 30 meters off the side of the truck, some of them much closer. And it's starting to get really tense. They pull up a truck that's got a Dishka, their version of a 50 cal mounted on it. And I've got this on GoPro as well. There's just multiple guys set up on a wall about 35 to 40 feet from me with RPGs like shouldered and ready to go. Like there is no way for us to fight our way out of this kill zone. So we take a defensive posture. We kick some of our leadership out to start trying negotiations with the Syrians to see if we can get out of there. The Syrians aren't budging. We're in, for lack of better terms, a Mexican standoff. And it's creeping past the hour-and-a-half point now. We're getting hot. We're way outside of our normal patrol time for this area. And that's finally when the Russians themselves show up in their vehicles and they start negotiating with the Syrians. And they finally get the Syrians to move out of the road and to let us egress out of there. So it was actually the Russians, and this was about a month before the war in Ukraine kicked off. The Russians came out, mediated for us, and got us out of there safely. Everybody knows that at least somewhat cares about national defense, that Turkey is the largest land army in NATO that's European-based. Turkey operates very efficiently. It's clear that they've had a lot of Western training. When they invaded into Syria several years back, they did it... Honestly, it looked remarkably like when the United States Army invaded Iraq, and the tactics were pretty similar. Now they're at a point where Turkey and their own militias do not necessarily agree in Syria and will fight it out. But most importantly, both of those groups label and identify almost every Kurdish group we work with in the area as terrorists. Like inside Turkey, they're considered official terror groups. Outside of Turkey, they're armed and equipped by America. And I've seen that firsthand. That's not a conspiracy. We equipped them to the teeth. And I can't really pull back all of the geopolitical reasons as to why, but essentially the Kurds have drawn the best worst hand. They make up a close to 15 to 20% of the populations of Syria, Turkey, Iraq, and about 12% of Iran, and they sit directly on top of the oil-producing regions in all of these countries, which makes them public enemy number one for each of the other countries, because the other countries have their own racial and ethnic groups, and they consider the Kurds other, not same. So it paints just a terrible bullseye on the Kurds' back. And anytime they make a push for autonomy, they're labeled terrorist and condemned by the international community.
Kurdish civilians included, right?
Kurdish civilians included. There was a famous instance while I was deployed. From our base, you could feel the ground shake every time a round impacted. In the span of 3 days, in 72 hours, they dropped over 900 artillery rounds on the Kurdish village we were staying with. It got so extreme by the time we were leaving Syria that we were actually going and spending the night in other villages and having it communicated through backdoor channels to Turkey. Hey, the Americans are here. You can't hit this village tonight. You risk killing the Americans. Because the meat shield strategy was the only thing we could come up with to really get Turkey to stop attacking civilians.
The ISIS prison revolt. Can we talk about that?
The last week of January in 2022, to set the stage, there's a huge prison complex in al-Hasakah, which is in the north of Syria. For years now, since the fight on ISIS stopped, the Kurds have taken it upon themselves to house and feed ISIS prisoners with very little help from the international community. Inside this, if you think about like a classic castle fortress kind of setup, it's got the huge old dirt walls you associate with the Middle East. There were 19 buildings inside the complex. The Kurds have been begging for help forever. The help wasn't coming. And this is in the rumor bucket, but we're pretty sure the Kurds knew the attack was coming. There were a lot of cell phone usage inside the prisons. There was coordination going on from inside to outside the prison. Signal intelligence had picked it up. Well, late one evening, a box truck drove up to the side of the compound wall and detonated an IED, which was a very common tactic when ISIS was still an at-large fighting force. Well, after the initial truck bomb goes off, more vehicles pour in through the hole that's been created in the wall, and they start passing out weapons to the ISIS prisoners inside this prison, because it's not like an American prison where everyone sits in a cell all day. It's an open-air prison where folks can wander freely between the buildings and kind of do their own thing. The Kurds only have enough manpower to kind of keep basic law and order and keep folks inside the walls. So, as these people are handing out weapons every direction they can hand them out, the ISIS fighters start taking control of the prison. I think within the first 24 hours they'd killed over 40 Kurdish prison guards. They had taken complete control of the compound. About an hour after the attack starts, American forces start getting spun up. My base in Talbadir was about an hour from al-Hasakah, so we start loading up all of our equipment, getting things ready. The Green Berets were already running what they call a team house directly in front of the prison complex. So it was called the Moore Team House, and it was a multi-story building with its own wall in front of it. And from the top of the multi-story building, you could actually see and fire down into the prison complex. As the night one unfolds, the National Guard, there was a contingency of National Guard we had with us as well, not at my base, but in that area of Syria. They brought in Bradley fighting vehicles, and they started forming a perimeter around the prison walls. And it's estimated maybe 100 prisoners escaped that first night, and then after that, onesies and twosies here and there if they got lucky. But on night one, it got savage pretty quick. The Kurds were engaging, not the Kurds, the ISIS fighters were engaging against the Bradley fighting vehicles. It was not advantageous to them because a 25mm Bushmaster is just an absolutely savage weapon. I was seeing people with small arms try to engage Bradleys, and the Bradleys were responding with tow missiles. And that's really how the first day went, but by day 2, the fighting had really kicked off, so a lot of our mission set had become, since we didn't have the Bradley fighting vehicles, we were manning positions that were looking down into the prison, but we were also providing resupply to the Bradleys, so even though it was, depending on their position, a few hundred meters from where we were at inside the team house, we'd have to drive up to it, rounds would kick off, you would load up the Bradleys as much as you could, pass off as much ammo. And this is the first time in my entire career, of about 11 years, that I'd ever heard like a Bradley crew say, hey, we're black on ammo, we need more ammo, and every time we would come up to resupply them again, they'd still be black on ammo and still need more resupply. So they were just absolutely shredding through rounds out there. At the same time, we were employing artillery and mortar fire into the prison compound, and I think by day 4 or 5, when we had confirmed there were no prison guards left alive, we started bringing in F-16s. And even on the passes where the F-16s weren't dropping any ordnance, they would just fly over so low it would kick up every single scrap of dust and smoke anywhere nearby and just bury you in it, because they were doing incredibly low passes over the prison. And there was a very particular smell to the Battle of Hasakah, and it's because they had put the entire... It was a huge city. Like, I would say it feels like you're in a New York suburb, kind of, like as far as the density and the amount of people go. And so they had shut down the entire city and they had mobilized their entire military. So every street you drove down, they had tires in the middle of the road and they were burning them for warmth because it was freezing cold. So the entire city, on top of smelling like the ordnance we were dropping, was just smelling like burnt tires and diesel. Nearing the end of the engagement, and off and on during the engagement, fighters had been surrendering to us. And by the end, the total tally was around 1,200 ISIS fighters had surrendered themselves back to us, and the other few thousand disappeared into the rubble, which is why it was incredible to me as a person who was experiencing it. Media in the West covered the event for like maybe half an hour. There's been no substantive follow-up on what actually happened there. Outside of the battle damage assessments we did, the Pentagon conducted, most of that stuff isn't public-facing. There's been almost no follow-up on the largest battle that America's been engaged in the last 10 to 15 years, easily.
Tell me more about your point of view.
You ever have those surreal moments in life? There was a moment where I was listening to Dreams by Fleetwood Mac and some earbuds. I was bored. It was late at night. This was looking down into the prison complex. And then you just have an F-16 fly in overhead and just absolutely pound this compound. And as the explosion goes off, and you're just listening to an innocent song from your childhood, and you're like, what is really going on here? Because up until the moment of the Hasakah prison break, there had been some interesting moments here and there, but a lot of it had kind of amounted to boredom and wondering what we were actually doing. And then at that moment, it's like the switch flips, and you're like, oh, this is what we're doing. This is why I'm here. Everything's exciting now.
So that prison, how much people can that prison hold if it's taking multiple Bradleys that are shelling at artillery, mortars, and F-16s, and that's still continuing for days and days and days? How big is that prison, and how many people were in there if it's taking all those units, all those artillery, tanks, and aircraft to take it down?
The how many people part is an interesting question. The only thing we have to go off of is estimates, because there wasn't a huge amount of accountability in place at the prison. The lowest estimate I've ever seen places 3,000 people there. The estimates we were using while we were there was closer to 4,500 to 5,000. And then you also have close to 900 what we call junior ISIS fighters. They were people who had been captured as members of ISIS below the age of 18. And they were held in the same complex, but in a different building inside the complex. Vice News actually talked to us about the Battle of Hasakah for about 45 minutes, but they only talk about the junior ISIS portion. They don't actually talk about the combat or what we were doing there. The other thing that I think is probably relevant about why it takes so much ordnance to take this one place down is this was a real-life siege. This was a siege in the 21st century. You have thick mud walls that have stood for hundreds and hundreds of years. Every single one of the buildings inside the compound was also made the exact same way. So you could launch multiple tow missiles at a building and it would still just be standing.
Oh, wow, okay.
It would be in bad shape, but it would still be standing. Okay. And then eventually they switched over to, and ISIS was already familiar with this because as they fought their way through Syria and through northern Iraq, the way they fought was by almost leveling everything they came across. As I mentioned with how the villages looked as we drove by earlier, they were used to fighting in and out of rubble, and there's a lot of ways that you can booby trap rubble and dig fighting positions into rubble that makes it incredibly hard to kill you and very hard to find you.
What do you want people to know about the Battle of Al-Hasakah?
I want people to understand that United States foreign policy is something to be questioned. I am kind of anti-war. I'm not anti our mission in the Middle East, but I wish that we would call things what they are. We're there to stop Turkey from genociding the Kurds. We're not there to fight ISIS anymore. There's almost no ISIS left there. I want our politicians to answer questions honestly about foreign policy, and I would like our public to return to holding our elected officials accountable. We took casualties, but they were from suicide, and since I left Syria, that base has been hit multiple times in the recent Iranian strikes. The base is not adequately prepared to fight a battle against drones and everything else that entails. So we have a lot of folks in what I call tripwire positions around the Middle East, where they're not adequately prepared to defend themselves, and if they die, then it's something the media can point to and say, hey, American soldiers have been killed, we have to do something about it, without ever asking the question of, why are the American soldiers there? So I left Syria in the spring of 2022. It was strange coming home. I don't want to compare it to like when the Vietnam vets came home, because a lot of the Vietnam vets, especially if you were infantry like I was, spent the vast majority of their time either in the suck or being shot at. Whereas when we returned to base, life wasn't comfortable, but it was okay. And we had internet access, and it was okay for us to talk to our family. So when I came home, I think my biggest challenge in transitioning back was probably how mundane everything feels. Like when you go and play what we jokingly call adult tag or hostile tourism, when you're there doing the thing, it's dangerous, it keeps your attention, you feel like you actually have a purpose, even if you're not sure if you understand what that purpose is. You know that at the end of the day, like surviving till sundown and then waking up again tomorrow is your objective ultimately. Then when you come back to America, you kind of fall back into that normal training cycle. You go back to every maintenance issue is the end of the world, and all hands on deck in the motor pool until the middle of the night for no reason. So that was a pretty hard transition.
I'm guessing you, well, I don't want to assume anything, did you have any struggles with PTSD?
Yes. Some of it was war-related. The rest of it was, very tragically, on my wife's birthday when I was in Syria, February 1st, 2022. We had a soldier kill himself, and I was one of the first people that responded to the bunker. And we airlifted him out the next morning into... just to think he was a happy kid. He was in his early 20s. And I don't know. I carried that differently because at this point in my career, I'd been around for a long time. I've been in service since I was 17. Everybody called me granddad. I've had gray hair since I was 15, so that doesn't help any with the equation there. And a lot of the soldiers I'd taken to Syria with me were born after 9/11, so to them I was granddad.
Is there anything else you want to share about your military career?
Yeah, I'd like to give you this absolutely bizarre example. So to avoid escalating things, and since we had taken like a pretty aggressive stance on not shooting at the Syrian army, and most of the time the Syrian army honored that and wouldn't shoot at us, it kind of devolved into this really dumb game. I'll give you an example. The way that they farm in Syria is with these 18-inch mounds that come up, and then an almost equally deep hole on the other side. Then you'll have another 18-inch mound, and these fields will just be absolutely gigantic, like acres and acres of just one solid field, all tilled just like this. Well, the Syrian army had blocked our path. The Syrian army was not supposed to exist in this patrol box that we were in, so it surprised us when we ran across them. Our interpreters were trying to negotiate with them. At that point in time, some Apache helicopters that actually came on station for us to give us some moral support and kind of tell the Syrians they should leave us alone. Well, at the same time, Russian Hind helicopters come on station too. So then you've got this awkward song and dance of both of our countries' helicopters circling each other. The interpreters come back to us and they say, hey, they're not going to let you pass down this road, but you can drive through this field directly adjacent to the road that has all those mounds I told you about. Well, as we come off-road, and I mean, even in our huge vehicles, when you're trying to drive through a field like this, the bumping is crazy. Like, everyone's being tossed in the air. I'm already standing because I'm behind the gun. Well, the Syrian army soldiers start running out into the field and, like, traffic guard stop our vehicles. So, like, they're putting hands out in front of them. And our drivers are being told to try not to run them over. So all of our drivers are just whipping hard left and right. Our vehicles are, for real, almost flipping over trying to navigate this field. And I look over, and one of my friends who had been in the Marine Corps before coming to the Army, his name was Gunning, his 50 cal had actually broke loose from the mount, and it's a blessing that this man is built like a Greek god, because the dude is leaning over the side of his truck, bear hugging his entire 50 cal, while the entire truck is being tossed into the air. At the same time, there's a rack that will hold my M4 right next to my 50 cal. My M4 bounces out of the rack, and I reach over and grab it from falling outside the truck, because I know I'm going to get absolutely destroyed by my chain of command if we get back and I've lost an M4. As I pull it back into the truck, I go to stuff it down between my legs, and we hit another bump, and the butterfly triggers on the 50 just crack me in the helmet and knock me out for a few seconds. So I'm upright because I'm clipped in by my gunner's harness, but I'm seeing stars and unconscious. And as we wheel out the other side of this field, we look back, and the Kurds, because Kurds always go out on mission with us, they were in their Toyota Hilux pickup trucks, and we just see them disappear down into this wadi, and we're like, oh, that's it, because the Syrian army guys are just like piling onto the bed of their truck. And then almost as if it's a commercial for Toyota, you just see this Hilux pickup truck come out of the other side of this wadi, like sideways, defying gravity, barely able to accomplish what our huge trucks have just accomplished. And they made it out the other side, but the Syrian army really loved to play these really stupid games of tag with us.
Oh, wow. Was that common this time?
Things of that nature were fairly frequent.
All right. What else about... well, you were in Iraq before you went to Syria. What was that like?
I was lucky. So northern Iraq now is an entirely different beast for the folks that are listening that haven't seen Iraq in 10, 15 years now. At night, when you're in northern Iraq, as you look around, especially if you're in any of the major cities, we were at the air base there, and as you look around, the Erbil is the name of the air base, so we were in Erbil, and as you look around, it kind of has the glow and the lights of Las Vegas now, especially since it's still a desert. You just have all these tall neon lights everywhere, buildings are being constructed, it looks like the economy is thriving. The mission set there now is incredibly limited. Almost everything happening in Iraq is to support missions in Syria or otherwhere else in the Middle East. Missions I won't really get into. After returning from Syria, we had a short award ceremony where we were presented with our combat infantry badges for the actions that we had seen and participated in Syria. After that, I became a headquarters platoon sergeant where I kind of managed the logistical affairs of our infantry company. I did that up until May of 2023 when I separated fully. I returned back to North Carolina. I went to work for a veteran advocacy group. We're working to make the Veterans Health Administration uphold its promise to our American veterans. Frequently, our appointments are canceled on us last minute. It takes months to actually get an appointment. So we're working through the construct of the VA Mission Act to make the VA more compliant to what the veteran actually wants and less beholden to what the bureaucratic state wants.
All right. Is there anything you want to do to conclude this interview?
Luke, I really appreciate you having me on. I think that the project that you are running here is amazing. It's so meaningful to actually capture the stories of World War II vets, Vietnam vets before they're gone. You have some interviews with the Forgotten Generation. The Korean vets are far and few between at this point. And someday in the future, folks like me with the Iraq and the Syria stories will be rare too. So thank you for what you do.